morning. Thank you so much for tuning in to this sermon this morning. I hope you and your family are doing well. I know for me personally, the more news that I watch and the more I'm aware of all the negative things that are happening in the world, it gets tougher and tougher to be apart from each other and from brothers and sisters in Christ. This morning for our sermon, we are going to continue talking about the Sermon on the Mount of Jesus. Remember that we're still talking about the Great Commission, our call to go. We're talking about what that looks like, and we're talking specifically about what it means to be a disciple, what it means to be a citizen in this kingdom. That's kind of the big two questions that the Sermon on the Mount answers. We started out, we talked about the Beatitudes and how this is setting up a new value system for the kingdom. These are the things that should be applauded and looked up towards. Then we talked about the disciples themselves and how it's going to be a little different. They're going to stand out. They're going to be this salt and light to the world, and that's going to bring about some persecution. But Jesus reminds us that, hey, that's a good thing, knowing not that the persecution in and of itself is good, but knowing that we are doing what we're supposed to when we face persecution and the promises that come after that. Well, now Jesus is going to transition into more of his teaching. You know, this was a common thing for rabbis in this time, that they had their interpretations of the Old Testament and of the law. And Jesus is going to essentially do that. And we're going to look at that here in a second. Before we get there was one funny thing I came across this past week or so that I thought really fits with kind of, what we're going to talk about, a little bit of kind of how easy it is to misunderstand things. But there's this little tweet, I think it was, that said, spice up your conversations with quotation marks. And it was 3 different examples of the sentence, "Congratulations on your baby." And basically, depending on where you put the quotation marks, it changes it, right? So, for example, "Congratulations on your baby," or "Congratulations on your baby," or "Congratulations on your baby." Right? You can see how with each one, it kind of puts a totally different spin on a pretty simple sentence. Well, I thought that was funny, but at the same time, I think that a lot of times that's how we can be when we communicate, especially through the written word, is that depending on what we emphasize when we read it, we can come away with almost entirely different meanings. And I think that this next passage is kind of a good example of that, because Jesus, he covers a lot of ground in 4 simple verses. And so this morning I want to start by us reading that, and then we're going to look at them verse by verse and hopefully make sure that we are following along with what he's doing and what he's saying and how he's getting to his conclusion, which is really all the teachings that are coming up. But in Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 17, Jesus says this, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Now, like I just mentioned, we want to make sure that we understand kind of verse by verse what he's doing here, because I think it's easy to pull out one of these verses and all by itself we can come up with some really weird conclusions. So I want to build all this piece at a time here and make sure that we're following along with what Jesus is doing. So verse 17, I'll read it again. "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." So I think the first question that we probably want to ask and to make sure we follow him is, what does it mean to fulfill? You think about this, there's actually one kind of common thing that comes out of people reading this, and that's thinking that Jesus kind of took care of the law. And I guess let me clarify on that. The law and the prophets, that was kind of a shorthand way of saying the Old Testament as we know it. They actually broke it into 3 categories: the law, the testament, and the writing, the law, the prophets, and the writings. And I think if you looked at those breakdowns, we'd kind of be surprised what falls under prophets and things like that, but it doesn't matter. This was Jesus' shorthand way of referring to the Old Testament. We have examples of that kind of usage for that, and it makes sense in this context here, because what is it Jesus is fulfilling? Well, it's not just the Pentateuch or those first 5 books, the Torah, as some may say. He's fulfilling the prophets as well. Anybody that's done a study through prophecies and which ones Jesus fulfilled and what those look like, it's amazing how much of the prophets talk about Jesus and what He's going to do when He comes. So, that's the first thing we got to make sure. But then I think the biggest question is this idea of fulfilled. A common thing that people kind of walk away with this verse is thinking that, well, Jesus took care of all those old things so that we don't have to. Jesus He fulfilled, it's almost like a lock and key. The Old Testament was this lock, and Jesus came along and He was the key, and because of that, well, the lock's useless now. You just throw it off to the side. I don't think at all that's what He's saying here. And in fact, I don't think that contrast, He says, I didn't come to abolish it. Well, if we look at it in those terms, that's exactly what He's doing. He's unlocking it so that we don't have to worry about it anymore. And that doesn't contrast with, what did I say about the prophets? He came and fulfilled that. So does that mean that all the prophets now are just done? There's no prophecies about things that are still yet to come? Think about, the prophecy of the lion and the lamb, right? There's still some things that we haven't quite seen yet. But instead, I think fulfill is more than that. All of everything that was trying to be communicated with the Old Testament, Jesus comes along and finds their full meaning and accomplishment in His teaching and ministry. Not just the laws, not just that He was the only one to be able to obey all those, but everything about, think about what we see of God in the Old Testament. It's really, we don't feel like we see a full picture in a lot of times. But yet with Jesus, what we see is a fuller picture of what God's heart was even in those Old Testament times. He comes and it's not just a lock and key kind of relationship. It's deeper than that. He is bringing to meaning and to fruition everything that we see in the Old Testament. Now, the simple follow-up here is, well, what about the Old Testament laws that we don't keep anymore? Aren't those abolished? Aren't those, things that really are done away with? That, we don't sacrifice animals for sins anymore, or for Thanksgiving offerings and all these different kind of things. Those are truly abolished. But I think the way we look at that and the way we understand it is not that, well, Jesus did it so that we don't have to, but that Jesus, which this is an easy one for sacrifices, that helps us to understand more deeply what it was that Jesus did for us. And really, same thing, it finds deeper meaning. Those sacrifices, the Passover lamb, this central key thing for them in the Old Testament, man, we see such a fuller picture of Jesus because of that. Now, Jesus now has that authority over that. And the rest of the New Testament is going to lay out how He is that one sacrifice. We don't need the blood of bulls and goats anymore, but instead, the blood of Jesus Christ is far superior. But they found their fulfillment and their meaning in Jesus. So that's what it means to fulfill, is that all those things, Jesus now takes authority over those, and we now understand that through this different lens, through a totally different lens. And that's part of what this is saying, is now that Jesus is here, these things are fulfilled. They're not abolished, they're not totally thrown away, but we can start to see through the lens of Jesus how some of these things connect. Well, let's move on to verse 18, and I think it'll help to kind of put this together even more. Verse 18 says this, "For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished." Some interesting things there, iota, dot, those, whether it's Hebrew or Greek, scholars kind of discuss this and debate it, but essentially the idea is even the smallest part of the written law that they had, that's not going to be thrown away until everything has accomplished. It says, until heaven and earth pass away, those things will not go away. Now, as we see, we're standing here on the earth. Heaven and earth has not passed away. Those things of the law have not disappeared. I mentioned this a second earlier, is you think about, well, what about that second phrase? Has everything been accomplished? Has everything that God set out to do in the Old Testament been accomplished? No, you can see prophecy and different prophets writing about a time that is to come that is far superior to what they're going through. And having lived through those years after that, we can say, man, a lot of the stuff that we even read in the Old Testament has not yet been accomplished. So the iota and the dot, all those things, they still are in this time of not yet being thrown away. Not everything is accomplished. Heaven and earth has not passed away. Those things have not disappeared. Now, that's going to lead really well into this next part. Now, I think this is where it starts to kind of wrap all this up. Verse 19, therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Now, first of all, let's think about this word commandments. Because it's really easy at this point in the conversation to kind of point this one way or the other, right? We can look at commandments and say, well, this is talking exactly about the Old Testament. That makes sense. There's plenty of evidence of that. Verse 19 starting with therefore, it's also easy to go the other way and say, these commandments that Jesus is about to teach, which is interesting because he's actually talking about Old Testament commandments that they're just misunderstanding. We'll get to that in other sermons. But it's easy to take it one way or the other. But if you look at how Matthew uses this word commandments, 9 times out of 10, or the majority of the time, he's talking about these Old Testament commandments, with one exception, which we'll get to. Matthew 19, 17 through 19 says, he said to him, why do you ask me what is good? There is only one who is good. If you would enter life, keep the commandments. He said to him, which ones? And Jesus said, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, honor your father and mother, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. When Jesus is referring to the commandments, he follows that up by giving more detail of the 10 commandments, of the ones given at Mount Sinai, those 10, right? That's what he was referring to when he says commandments. And then again in Matthew 22, 36 through 37, teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Quoting Deuteronomy, right? He's talking about these Old Testament commandments when it's used throughout Matthew. I told you there's one exception, and that's in the Great Commission. And he says, teach them all that I have commanded you. So at that point, he looks back retrospectively and he says, hey, I've taught you things. And we're going to see in these follow-up sermons, he actually teaches us how to better understand the Old Testament even. But when he says, relaxes these commandments, he's not abolishing the Old Testament. In fact, I think that's exactly what he's pointing to. You look at verse 18, he says, not an iota or a dot will pass away until all is accomplished. He's saying, look, we have to be careful. We have to dig into this and make sure that we understand. So what exactly is being condemned here? When he's talking about commandments, I believe he's talking about the old specifically in this case, and I think it's going to end up being applied to the new, but I think he's referring to both. So what exactly is being condemned? What is he saying that's wrong? Well, he starts out and he says, those that relax and teach others to do the same. So if you look at the Old Testament and you say, well, no, that's, and that's kind of the danger we fell into and look at the first verses. It's saying, yeah, Jesus came to kind of put that key in the lock and then that lock is discarded. We can't do that. And I think that's what he's warning against here is you can't just say, hey, because I'm fulfilling it, because I am what a lot of this is pointing towards, you don't just throw all that away. So much of that is still profitable for teaching, as 2 Timothy is going to say. This is not just something to be thrown away. Instead, we are to do and to teach. We are to look back at that and do those things as well as teach them. Now, obviously I've given you examples of how this doesn't apply. Things like sacrifices, food laws, there's a couple of different random things here that we kind of generally accept we don't do anymore. But how did we come to that point? Was it just because, random people said, well, those things are things we don't do anymore? No, people seriously sat down with the commands of the Old Testament, with the teachings of the Old Testament, and compared them to what we see in Jesus, through Jesus as a lens, and said, you know what? Jesus seems to not find this as necessary anymore. Think about the sacrifices. He says, look, he lays down his life. He says this time and time again. And then we have teachings after that say clearly, Jesus was that once and all sacrifice. So we look back at the sacrifices and we say, those are not things that we need anymore. We look at the Old Testament through the lens of Jesus and prayerfully and patiently we wrestle with, well, is that something that's done away with? Is that something that we don't see happening anymore through Jesus? And this is what we do. It's not that we just throw it away and toss it aside, but instead we prayerfully consider the Old Testament through the lens of Jesus and honestly do some things that maybe we don't feel comfortable doing, that we would rather just say, well, Christ gives us freedom, and so because of that we throw just all of it out and start anew. But instead we prayerfully consider the things that are taught in the Old Testament and see which of them still fit with everything that Jesus teaches. And if we don't see any example of why we wouldn't do that anymore, then we do it. And we teach others to do the same. I kind of think about this, it's kind of lifting up the people that do this with the Old Testament. And I think this is one thing we all appreciate about Clark, is those people that take that extra time and extra effort to go back to the Old Testament and truly wrestle with it and say, hey, this God, even though on surface when we're writing it, when we're looking at it in this out of its context, for our context, it's really hard for us to see God in a lot of these things. But I think that it takes faith to wrestle with that, and it takes humility to wrestle with that, and then try to understand what we see in the Old Testament through the lens of Jesus. And that person will be called great. And I think that's where I want to end on this verse, is one final note about this least and great. I don't think we're supposed to read into this some sort of class system within the kingdom. I think really this is just a play on word. If you think about the rabbis in the time, they had what they referred to as least commands and heavy commands. They kind of referred to, well, these are the lesser commands, these are the greater commands. And they had this sort of talking about, the way that they talked about this kind of stuff. And so I think he's just playing on words, saying that, hey, even these least ones that you may just want to push off to the side, if you push those things to the side, you're going to be called least in the kingdom of heaven. And if you really want a way for understanding maybe what is he getting at, think of it in terms of esteem, right? In God's eyes, you're still in the kingdom of heaven. You may throw away this little thing because you don't think it's necessary anymore, but God's going to say, man, I really wish, your life could have been a lot better. You could have done more for the kingdom. Whatever it could be, it could have been so much better had you considered that something that's still worth your time today. It's not a class system, but instead it's really just an exhortation to say, hey, take the Old Testament seriously. Look at that, wrestle with it. It may be difficult, but it's going to be worth your time to do that, and also teach people how the Old Testament, how we can see God through some of the things that we maybe struggle with just seeing on a surface level. So, all that being said, verse 20 is where we kind of wrap it up and where we then transition into Jesus' teaching on all the law, which we'll get into in other sermons. But verse 20 says this, "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Now, so Jesus starts off, he says, hey, unless your righteousness exceeds these people, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. So let's start with, who is he talking about? Well, in the Gospel of Matthew, we're actually introduced to the scribes back in chapter 2, verse 4. They essentially are the recognized theological experts of Jesus' day. They're the ones that they confront and say, hey, we know that the Messiah is supposed to be born here. What else can we know about him? They're the Bible teachers of that day. They're the college professors of the Bible in that day. They're the people that people go to get more understanding of God's Word. Well, that's the scribes. Well, the Pharisees, we actually see the first time in chapter 3, verse 7. And essentially, there's some kind of, political reformist movement inside of Judaism. Essentially, this is a sect of Judaism that says, hey, we need to get serious about some stuff here. Now, everything that's been said up to now, verse 17, 18, and 19, the scribes and Pharisees would have been like, yeah, right on, you got it. That's right, a strict, don't let go of any of these commandments. In fact, the Pharisees, they went to extremes to try to make sure to follow every single little commandment, whatever it was. They are right on board. And then in verse 20, you could even look at that. Maybe they're thinking, well, like, hey, yeah, your righteousness has got to exceed ours. We are the threshold. But I don't think that's what's going on here. If righteousness were a literal outward obedience to the rules and regulations, then the Pharisees would be top notch. It would be hard to top them. It would be almost possible for somebody as kind of unaware of the Old Testament as we are in today's terms. But they were the top-notch guys of following things to a strict, literal obedience, outward especially. But I don't think Jesus is commending them for that. I don't think he's patting them on the back and saying, hey, you got to be like these guys to get into the kingdom of heaven. And I actually think you see the signs of this back in chapter 3:7, where we first see the Pharisees. The first thing we see is John call them a brood of vipers. And he essentially is talking about them and saying, look, there's something wrong with you guys. So we get that clue. And then here, when he says that, that should kind of pique our ears. That should say, oh, wait a second. We've already seen the Pharisees are not exactly what we maybe should be looking forward to here. We shouldn't be aiming for this. In fact, the Beatitudes, right, some of those are going to go directly against what the Pharisees do. But as Matthew plays out, as it goes further and further, we actually see that the Pharisees and the scribes tend to be some of Jesus' enemies. The way that everything is handled, they kind of become the adversary in a lot of different ways. And it's in chapter 23 that we start to get a very clear explanation as to what it was that they did wrong. And this is where I think we can dig in and understand, what did Jesus mean by our righteousness exceeding this? So in Matthew chapter 23, we're going to first look at verses 1 through 3, where Jesus kind of introduces this whole speech he's going to give about here. And I think we can start to see it. But starting in verse 1, Jesus said to the crowd and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do and observe what they tell you, but not the works that they do. For they preach, but they do not practice." He says, look, the scribes and the Pharisees, they sit in the seat of a teacher. They sit in the seat of the one interpreting the law to you. However, they may teach the right thing, but when you look at their actions, those are not the actions of someone that you want to follow. So right here we see there's this deep hypocrisy in the way that they live, that they teach things that they themselves don't go out and live, at least on a core level of how they should be living. Well, he goes on, and I think kind of the key one that we need to see is verses 23 through 28. It goes like this: "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. Those you ought to have done, without neglecting the others. You blind guides, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the plate, that outside may be clean also. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanliness. So you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." So when Jesus is telling us in verse 20, your righteousness needs to exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees, he's not saying that we've got to keep this literal strict obedience. In fact, I think that obedience is a part of it, but this outward obedience was the issue that they struggled with. And I think what Jesus is saying here is that, hey, you can't just be okay with kind of going through the motions and doing everything that you think you're supposed to do, but instead, you've got to let this permeate your life. You've got to let this permeate your heart to where your heart is the thing that's changed. You know, we talked about the Old Testament. Ezekiel, his prophecy is that, hey, we're going to have a new heart. This heart of stone will be replaced with this heart of flesh. And here we see Jesus teaching us how to go about that, is that, hey, we don't just settle for doing things on the outside, but instead we allow these things to change us from the inside out. This is how we exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. So when we look back at this passage as a whole, you know, the key things we got to remember about this is that this fulfilling of the Old Testament, this fulfillment in Jesus, is that all of the Old Testament, everything that it stood for, everything that it taught, we find deeper meaning and deeper understanding. He is the lens through which we understand God through the Old Testament. We put those things side by side. We don't throw away the Old Testament. We don't throw away the law and the prophets. But instead, with Jesus, almost as a commentary, we better understand the Old Testament. We better understand what it was God was doing through all of that. God through Jesus came and fulfilled and gave us a better understanding of those things. Not abolishing, not throwing away. Just like he said with those commandments, those things are not going to be thrown away. But instead, through Jesus, we have a better understanding of what the purpose of these commandments were. Which ones truly bring about righteousness, and which ones were dead weight and difficult for us to do, and such as sacrifices, where Jesus is a far superior version of what we saw through the Old Testament. He changed the way that we look at the Old Testament. It's still relevant for us. It's still useful and worth us obeying, but we do that through the lens of Jesus. And then he lays out that we obey not in the way that others tend to do, not in the way that even politicians in this world tend to do, not this outward, everything looks right on the inside, but instead our obedience is focusing both on the inside and the outside with humility and with honesty. The Old Testament, that law, it's not to be discarded. We can still learn about God with Jesus. We understand that much better. And we are to live in a way where our righteousness is not just an outward doing. And we're going to see that with all of these teachings that are about to come up. Jesus is going to break this down for us even better. And this serves as an introduction to say, hey, these old commands, we're not just throwing them out the window, but instead, I'm going to help you understand them. I'm going to help you understand what the true purpose was behind some of these laws and what we can look at today and say, hey, this is a better way of understanding, for example, what it means, do not murder. It's not just about stopping ourselves short of that act, but instead, we must not have a heart that has murderous intent inside of it. So, hopefully, this kind of sets up what we're going to talk about in following sermons. Hopefully, this is something that challenges us. When I think of the world today, when I think of seeing the brokenness that's all around us, we have to push ourselves to say, hey, the things that we profess on the outside, are we truly living that on the inside? Are we truly seeking to love others? Are we showing people grace? Are we seeking out justice? Those weightier matters of the law that Jesus is going to condemn the Pharisees for overlooking. Are we truly focused on those things in our life? And I think, for me, that's something that really challenges me to say, hey, am I doing everything I can? And I know it's difficult in our situation, in this situation where we're kind of all in our little boxes and we can't get out and really experience the world. But hopefully this is something that challenges us, that when we're around people, even if those limited interactions that we have, that we are truly living the way that Jesus wants His disciples to live. And hopefully this has been a little pat on the back and appreciation for the Old Testament. I'm hoping you dive into that and understand that, yes, it's difficult to understand. I think that's why we have Jesus, to help us understand that even better. But we can truly learn so much from understanding those stories and the teachings and the law and the prophets and even the writings. Thank you so much for tuning in this morning. I pray that this has been helpful. If there is anything you need, if you would like to become a Christian and you'd like to talk to myself or someone else from the church to how to do that and what that looks like, we'd love to do that with you. Or if you just need prayers, I think that's the hardest thing for us to do right now, is to realize that we have to actively reach out for help. I know personally, it's just difficult being alone. And if you're in that situation, do not hesitate to reach out to someone. Even if it's not the church, even if it's not the elders, reach out to someone and just say, hey, look, I just need somebody to talk to. I need somebody to help me through this. Look out for each other. Take care of each other. We love all of you, and we look forward to the time that we can either meet for the first time or be back together as a family. Thank you, and may the Lord bless you and keep you.